Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a pretty complicated situation, one that's, well, it directly impacts farmers.
Absolutely. This is a big one.
So, farmers applied for this loan forgiveness program. It was part of Section 105 of the American Rescue Plan Act, the ARPA.
Right.
They got confirmation, everything seemed good.
Seems straightforward so far.
But then the payments, they never actually came through.
Yeah, that's a problem.
And to make matters worse, the whole program got repealed later on. So now there's a lawsuit.
Things escalated quickly.
So our deep dive today, we're focusing on one really important question. Was there a real legally binding contract between the government and the farmers?
The million-dollar question.
We're going to be going through court transcripts, legal documents, the whole shebang. We really want to understand, both sides of this.
We need to see the full picture.
Absolutely. So let's kick things off with the farmer side of the story. I mean, they're the ones alleging that there was a breach of contract. And it seems like their whole argument comes down to some really specific wording, like in the ARPA legislation itself and on that FSA 2601 form that farmers had to fill out.
It all comes down to the details.
Exactly.
So the farmers are really zeroing in on that language in Section 105 of ARPA. It says the secretary shall provide payment. And they're basically saying, look, shall means it's an obligation. It's not optional.
It's not a suggestion.
Exactly. They're even bringing up a Supreme Court case about the Affordable Care Act. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Where they had similar language, and the court said it was legally binding. So they're trying to make that connection.
They're saying if shall was binding in that huge case, it should be binding here, too. Makes sense. But is it really that simple? What actually makes a contract legally binding? And do the farmers' arguments actually meet those requirements?
Okay, so to be legally valid, a contract generally needs three main things: offer, acceptance, and consideration.
Okay, so offer. That's like one side proposes the agreement, right?
Right. Exactly. And acceptance, well, that's the other side agreeing to those terms.
Makes sense. But what's this consideration thing?
Right. Consideration means each side has to give something of value in exchange for the other's promise. Something's got to be exchanged.
Gotcha. Like a trade. So let's talk about that FSA 2601 form. The farmers, they check option 1 on the form. Is that really enough to count as acceptance? Like, is it the same as signing on the dotted line?
Good question.
And what about the whole consideration part of this?
Well, that's where things get a little messy.
Okay, how so?
The farmers say that checking that box, that was their acceptance. And they're saying their consideration was giving up the right to appeal the calculated debt relief amount.
I see. So they're saying they gave up something to get something?
Right. But the government, they're pushing back on both those points. They're not buying it.
Interesting. Okay, so let's switch gears and look at the government's defense.
Right.
They're claiming that this whole thing, it wasn't a contract, it was a financial assistance program.
Right, that's their argument.
But are they saying that just because ARPA is this giant piece of legislation that somehow makes it different? Like, does that give them an out?
It's part of what they're saying, yeah.
Yeah.
They keep bringing up that other parts of ARPA specifically talk about contracts. But Section 105, nope, not there.
I see. So they're saying there's a difference between programs that are meant to be like ironclad contracts and those that are more, I don't know, policy-based.
Exactly. They're trying to draw a line.
It sounds like they're trying to create some wiggle room, legally speaking.
You could say that.
But what about that FSA 2601 form? I mean, the farmers are saying it's a contract, so how's the government seeing it differently?
Well, they're saying that form, it was just an informational notice. Basically, it was just there to help process a request for payment.
A request. So they're saying the farmers were just asking nicely.
That's kind of what they're getting at. They're using specific language from the form to support this. Like they call it an informational notice and say the farmer is a customer making a request.
That's interesting. So they're really clinging to those specific words. But does that actually weaken the argument that the I accept box meant it was a contract?
That's what the court will have to decide.
And what about the whole consideration thing again? I mean, these farmers, they took action based on this promise of loan forgiveness. They were relying on it.
Right. They're saying they made decisions based on that promise.
So how does the government address that?
They're basically saying, yeah, we get it. The farmers might have relied on it, but detrimental reliance. Just that by itself, not enough to create a legal obligation in this specific court.
So they're saying, yeah, we see the human side of this, but legally there's a line. We're already seeing how complicated this case is. Both sides are really digging into specific words and legal ideas to build their arguments.
It's going to be a tough one to unravel.
It really is. This whole thing, it really makes you think, On one hand, you have Congress. They can make laws, change policies.
Right.
But then you have these farmers who relied on those policies. They took action based on what the government was telling them, and now the program is gone.
It really raises questions about how much people can trust government programs. Like, what happens when these programs change or they just disappear completely?
It's got to be frustrating for these farmers. I mean, if the court sides with them, could that set like a precedent? Could it affect how Congress makes laws in the future?
Oh, absolutely. It could have a huge impact on how they write and implement legislation. Lawmakers might start being more careful about making promises they can't keep.
I see. So they might think twice before making a promise that could be hard to reverse later on.
Exactly. This one case, it could change how the government creates programs in the future.
Wow, that's a lot of weight on this case. But okay, before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the court. What are the main things they'll be looking at when they make a decision?
Well, they're going to be looking at the language used in both ARPA and that FSA 2601 form.
Right. Wait.
Was the wording, strong enough to create a real legal obligation, or was it more vague, like suggesting the program could change? That's a key point here.
It sounds like every single word and phrase is going to be under a microscope.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Both sides have totally different interpretations of everything.
Didn't the farmers bring up some kind of legal precedent, too? Something to support their case?
They did. They cited something called 1 USD Section 109.
Okay, and what is that exactly?
Well, it deals with repealing laws, like statutes.
Yeah.
And what happens to obligations that were created under those laws.
So are they saying that even though the program is gone, the government still has to keep its promise to forgive those loans?
That's basically it. But the court, they have to decide if that particular precedent really fits in this specific case.
Got it. So the court has to the language, the precedents, the whole context, everything.
Exactly. They have to figure out which side makes the stronger case.
Anything else they might consider?
Oh, yeah. They'll probably look into the legal differences between a contract and a financial assistance program.
That seems tricky.
It is. It's a really nuanced area of law. And the government, they're arguing that this program was more like financial assistance.
Which means?
Well, they're saying it gives them more flexibility,
Right.
that there aren't as many strict legal requirements.
But the farmers are saying there was a promise made, and they relied on it, and it hurt them when it wasn't kept. Does that hold any weight in a case like this?
That's the big question. And honestly, it's not always clear-cut. The court has to figure out if the farmer's reliance on that promise was reasonable, if it was foreseeable, and if it was directly tied to what the government did. It's not an easy concept to sort out.
Sounds like the court has a lot of work to do.
They do.
This isn't just about who wins or loses, This case, it's about interpreting the law, figuring out what the government can and can't do, and maybe setting a precedent that will affect how the government deals with people in the future.
It really highlights that balance, between Congress's power to make and change policy and the impact those changes have on people who trusted the government.
Absolutely. And speaking of impact, let's bring it back to our listeners. To the farmers who are waiting for the court to make a decision, what does all this mean for them right now?
Well, right now they're stuck in limbo. They just have to wait and see what the court decides. It's all going to come down to that decision, whether or not they get the debt relief they were promised.
It's got to be stressful. Their whole livelihood is on the line here. They're dealing with real financial issues because of this situation.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And their situation, it's part of this bigger fight, this debate about what government programs are supposed to be, how much people can rely on them.
So it's about their individual experience, but it's also about these bigger questions about the role of government, the limits of its power, and what it really means to have a contract, especially when the government is involved. It's a lot to think about.
It really is.
This whole case, it really shows how connected everything is in our government.
Yeah, it's all intertwined.
You have Congress making the laws, then the executive branch putting them into action, and then the courts have to step in and interpret everything, especially when there's, a disagreement. It's this constant back and forth, power checks, balances.
Checks and balances, yeah, that's the key.
This lawsuit, it's like the perfect example of that whole system in action.
It really is.
It's like each branch of government has its own role, They're all kind of, I don't know, dancing around each other. But in the middle of it all, you have these people whose lives are being directly affected by these decisions.
Right, real people with real problems.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the legal details.
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, this case is about people's lives, their jobs, how much they trust the government. These farmers are dealing with real stress, financial and emotional, because of this whole
Oh,
situation.
no doubt about it.
Earlier you mentioned that the government is basically saying Congress can change policy whenever they want,
Right. They're saying it's their right.
even if it means changing programs that people were depending on. But where do we draw the line? Can the government just make a promise, have people take action based on that promise, and then just change their mind without any consequences?
That's the million-dollar question. Congress definitely has the power to change or even get rid of laws. But the question is, can they go back and erase obligations that were already, set in motion?
So even if they can change things going forward, they might not be able to just wipe away promises that were already made and that people acted on.
That's what the farmers are arguing. They're saying the government made a commitment, they held up their end of the bargain, and now the government is trying to back out.
It's a tough spot to be in for sure. And it raises some serious questions about fairness, about holding the government accountable, and, just how far their power actually goes. What do you think? What could happen with future government programs because of this case? Could this make people less likely to trust those programs, less likely to participate?
It's definitely a possibility. I mean, if the court says it's okay for the government to break its promises, well, that could really damage public trust. And that would make it a lot harder to create and implement policies that could actually help people. People need to feel like they can rely on the government, that they can trust what they're being told.
It's all about balance.
It is.
The government needs to be able to adapt to new situations, but people also need to know that the government will keep its word, especially when those promises have a real impact on their lives.
Absolutely. This whole case really highlights how important it is for the government to be clear about what they're promising, to think about the consequences of their actions, and to honor the commitments they make, especially when those commitments affect people's lives and communities.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in our deep dive. We've looked at the legal arguments, talked about what might happen because of this case, and really tried to understand the human side of it all. And to our listeners, especially the farmers who are going through this right now, we want you to know that we're thinking of you and hoping for the best possible outcome.
It's important to remember that even with all these complicated legal battles, there are real people at the heart of it all.
And to everyone listening, remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, keep learning, and never be afraid to ask questions.
There's always more to learn and explore, and we're here to help you make sense of it all.
Until next time, keep diving.